work with you in a different way. I thank you very, very much.
With upcoming hearings for Chuck Hagel and John Brennan, the current focus on foreign policy is likely to continue, although the question still lingers. What is the Obama Doctrine? Or more to the point, is there an Obama Doctrine? According to The Economist, the president's main goal is to avoid costly international entanglements as he prioritizes domestic concerns. It is a tricky endeavor given the state of the world. In addition to the crisis in Syria and the nuclear standoff between Israel and Iran, there are new protests in Egypt, where nearly 60 people have died. And in Mali, the U.S. has been assisting French and African forces to push back al-Qaeda-linked militants in the northern half of the country. And in the last 24 hours, the New York Times reports that the Pentagon is considering setting up a base in North Africa to monitor militant groups. Quote, for now, officials say they envision flying only unarmed surveillance drones from the base, though they have not ruled out conducting missile strikes at some point if the threat worsens. Joining us now from Cairo is NBC News foreign correspondent Ayman Mohideen. Ayman, we began this segment talking about the Obama Doctrine, or the difficulties in articulating a broad set of foreign policy goals. That is infinitely compounded given the state of play and also changing leadership in the Middle East. Give us the latest from Egypt, where things are certainly in a state of turmoil. What's your read on how this affects President Morsi's grip on power?
Well, you know, one of the news that came out today actually is very importantly linked to the United States, because the defense secretary here, or the minister of defense, the head of the armed forces, came out with a statement saying that the country was on the verge of collapse, or the state was on the verge of collapse if the country could not reconcile its political differences. Now, why we say that's important is because the Egyptian military receives close to $1.5 billion from the U.S. government, and more importantly has a very strong and close working relationship with the U.S. military. So you get a sense really of how important this state institution is to the overall effects here on the ground in Egypt, and the kind of communication that the U.S. government has directly with the Egyptian military. It is a backdoor channel, but it is a very important one for the region. Alex.
Ayman, we look at what's happening in other sort of states where the government has a tenuous grip on power, or the government it's basically a failed state, and we've seen radicals, al-Qaeda-linked networks rushing in basically to the host cells to take over virally. What happens in Egypt if this government does fall? Who fills the gap?
Well, right now, obviously, we're nowhere near that yet. The government has all of its institutions still intact. There are, indications that the police force, or the Ministry of Interior, has been the most degraded state institution. The police really has not been able to carry out basic law and order functions on a day-to-day basis, and that's what's jeopardizing the overall security. But what we've seen in the past, and this is why it's important to the region and to the U.S. and the world, really, is that in areas like the Sinai Peninsula, if Egypt doesn't exercise strong sovereignty and control over that, it can become a safe haven for the type of terrorist elements or armed militant groups that can carry out attacks on Israel, that can destabilize Egypt, that can threaten the Suez Canal, and that has global implications and regional ones as well. So the concern really has to do with security, not necessarily right now the civil institutions of the country here in Egypt.
I want to bring in our folks in New York. David, we're talking about the Obama Doctrine and or whether it exists, whether it can exist when you have a series of sort of calamities that have befallen one region of the world. There are no regional partners that you have to work with, or that you know well enough to work with. Where does this put the president?
Well, I think the president has been very clear, if you look over the last few years, what he said after Libya, what he said after the initial Egyptian revolution, that he's willing to lead America into conflicts when we can actually have a good impact, when there's a cost-benefit analysis performed, how much it will cost to be involved. Libya, the cost was not putting in ground troops, but working with the French and the British. And when we can do it in a multilateral way, so it's not the U.S. dictating its will or imposing itself in other parts of the land. It's not as clear as the Monroe Doctrine. It's also not as clear as the neocon doctrine,
or the Bush Doctrine,
which is that we go in and blunderbuss our way towards democracy, which didn't really work. And so it means each case is a little bit different, and it requires a certain amount of subtlety. And the other thing that I think the president has shown, usually good, not always good, is patience, trying to figure out how to do things right rather than rushing in. And you do lose some some opportunity if you take your time, but putting the right coalition together and sussing out a situation. Even though people in Egypt were yelling at him earlier to get involved and push Mubarak out, it took him a while to sort of figure out the best way to do that.
Well, patience is difficult too when you have humanitarian conflicts like the one in Syria, right, Karen? I mean, that is just continued bloodshed, and the president has basically done nothing about it and hasn't really apologized for doing nothing, and has basically said we will get involved where we can get involved and where we have the resources to get involved. He's giving another $150 million in aid to the Syrian people. Yeah. That was announced this morning, but there's a sense that much more can and should be done.
Well, and I think part of what we're seeing unfold is the new reality of how we have to engage in the world. We're not going to, we've talked about this before, we're not going to have wars where we end with some big signing ceremony and we've sent 100,000 troops or 200,000 troops.
Mission accomplished?
That's right. That's just not realistic. Part of the problem in Syria, I agree with you. I wish we were more engaged, but I also take the argument that, okay, who would we arm? Who would we side with? I mean, one of the things we saw in Benghazi is, on one hand, there were the group of people who were supposed to be on our side, and then they flipped to the other side. And I think that's part of, we have not had the level of engagement in this part of the world to really understand these networks, to really understand how they're working and what those systems are. And I think going forward, that's why we're going to have a new type of engagement. I think that's what Secretary Clinton was talking about last week.
Eamon, before we let you go, what's the expectation in terms of U.S. leadership in the region? I mean, this is a whole new generation of activists, reformers, people in government. Is there the expectation that the U.S. is going to be even that involved?
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're very much a double-edged sword here. The United States supported dictators in this part of the world for many years. People here resent that, and that has built a tremendous amount of hostility towards the U.S., and there's a reservoir of hatred. They're hoping with the new changes that the United States will change its policy, favoring democratic transition over stability and sometimes dictators. Alex?
NBC's Eamon Mohideen, thank you. Stay safe. We'll be coming back to you for updates throughout the week. And thank you to my